Instructional sequence, aka lesson plans. Normally, when you see unit frameworks, even by Heidi H. Jacobs or others, all you see is the top part of the unit. That's great, it's all very valuable. But the problem is, if you don't specifically connect the framework of the unit to the day-to-day instructional sequence in your classroom, there is still a giant disconnect between the standards and the reality. Because you could have done all this work, but that doesn't mean my day-to-day lesson is reflecting all of that work. So it's very important that units include the instructional sequence. This becomes the lesson plans for the unit. They end up being done up front. Now, a lot of people ask, well, what if I want to still collect, lesson plans? I know what they're, or, I want to know where they're at. What I did as a principal is they always did units up front. But then I still, week to week, would have them cut and paste whatever days from that unit they were doing that week, so I could still track where they were every day. It didn't take any extra work. It took 10 minutes on their part to do it for every subject. It was just cutting and pasting, but it helped me still, look at the pace. And if someone was walking in the room, I could still see exactly where they're at because that was a separate document. But it came straight out of this unit framework. It wasn't any extra or added work. Does that make sense? Some principals, they don't need that. They're like, you know what? Just put a star on the one you're at today, or cross it out when you're done with one, and just leave this on your desk. That's certainly a possible way to do it as well. It's whatever kind of works for your system and teachers and how you provide feedback within your own building. So here we go for the instructional sequence. Now, the instructional sequence format we have here is what I call the OMA format, so you can see that in there. It is as basic you can get an instructional sequence without losing the good research-based strategies behind it. This is as basic as you can get. The O is just the objective. What skills are you expecting your students to master at the end of that lesson? Not the end of the week, the end of the lesson. If students don't feel accountable to something that day, we all check out. So this gives them Velcro and focus for what's happening in that day. The M is just methodology. How are you going to get your students to be able to master that objective or that skill by the end of the lesson? And A is assessment. This is a formative assessment, and we'll talk about it more in a minute, but how are you going to actually determine whether students got mastery or not? So that's the OMA format that's on here. I'm going to walk through each one before you go look at samples, because as you notice, all the teachers did more or less detail with it, and that's okay. You can talk about the level of detail that you want at your building, or some teachers just like more detail or not. But we're going to talk about the bare minimum detail here. So here's what it looks like, just OMA in the boxes. After the O, I always have them write which standard goes with it. Now, if there's only one standard in this unit, because a lot of the reading units are only going to have one, you don't need to do that. If this were science or social studies, I like to know just to easily make that connection. There are optional things that you can include on here as well. If your teachers assign homework, I encourage you to add that into the box, because you want to know, is this a relevant homework that's actually being effective as an additional application of that skill versus busy work, and that helps document it. Some people also like the specific resources for that day included in the box rather than just in a big pool at the very top of the unit. That's helpful for some people so they know which text they're using that day. These are optional. What research says is you need to have the O, the M, the A. Okay, here we go. So we start with how would we do this? You don't write them OMA. You write them in a different order. You write the objective first, then the assessment, and you do the methodology last. That's the order you want to write them in, and we're going to explain why. Starting with the objective, this is what are the skills the students are mastering today? Here's how you figure out your objectives for every day. You look at your skills in your skills section. Most of them have been unpacked, so you have multiple skills. The first thing you do is number those in the order that it makes sense to master them. Maybe the order I wrote them in is fine, but maybe I have to change the order. Just number them in the order. But then you have a distinction to make. If I think that that skill can be mastered in one day, I just cut and paste it as my objective. But if I think that that skill is going to take many days to master, I need to decide how am I going to break it down into smaller pieces so they're still mastering something smaller every day. If I cut and paste the same thing 3 days in a row, what does that tell my students? It doesn't matter. Check out for 3 days. Because I don't need to know it until the last day. It's just like people who wait for the study guide day to pay attention. because you've told them, I don't need to pay attention until study guide day because everything I need to know is right there. So we're trying to change that mentality to say every moment counts in our instruction. It's that whole time on task or engagement idea. So if you think it's going to take more than one day, you want to break it down into smaller skills, working up to that, and spread it over 2 or more days. After you do that, there are some added objectives you should add in. You should have an objective for the day that they're integrating Catholic values, because if you don't make it a specific objective or goal that day, it probably, again, won't happen. So you want to infuse that in. Now, if they decided to do that with every single text every single day, that would just be added in as a second objective that day. That's fine. You want to be sure to add an objective for developing the enduring understanding. This usually is at the end of the unit before the final summative assessment, so that there's a day where they're developing that enduring understanding. In kindergarten, they're probably just explaining it back to you, as opposed to determining it on their own. And finally, you need to add a day for the summative assessment. The objective that day is not take a test. You're not assessing whether they know how to take a test. You're assessing whether they can demonstrate mastery of the skills. So you want it to be still worded in a way that shows what skill they're mastering. These objectives should be written on the board at the beginning of every lesson. So they're up front and center. Take a minute and look at the objectives for the different units there. Again, it's after the O. Try not to get caught up in the M and the A because that's a lot on there at the moment. And just look how they decided to break down the objectives. Objectives are always skills. They're always written with the appropriate level of blooms. Okay. The next piece, if you write your objectives well, the next piece, remember, we skip and write the assessments next. It is very easy if you wrote your objectives well, because more often than not, you're just cutting and pasting your objective down there. The assessment, the purpose is to determine the level of mastery of each student. Did each student get there or not? The process to do this is you just want to have them independently do whatever the objective is. It's important that teachers do not look at this as a grade. It should never be entered in the grade book. It is merely formative data. It's just letting you know which students are there, which are having difficulty, and how do I adapt and address it the next day if I'm seeing several students with this misconception or several with this misconception. I can correct that in 2 minutes at the beginning of my next class. Versus, I have one kid who needs lots of help, I need to think of something different for that child. So this is just formative information. There are 2 common examples, and you'll see them both used interdispersed throughout. One is just an exit ticket. Whatever your objective is, have them do it on an index card before they leave the classroom. So if it was to define whatever the skill or strategy is, on the index card, they define it. If they're explaining how to use the graphic organizer, on the index card, they explain how to use the graphic organizer. The other common formative assessment is to collect their filled out organizer. So if they filled it out independently, then I would just collect it and I can see exactly who was able to do that skill with the text or who wasn't, so I can help them again the next day. The thing about the formative assessment is you have to make sure it's done independently. So if anything they're doing during the lesson is done as a group, that can't be collected as a formative assessment because you don't know whose mastery you're assessing there. It has to be something that's being shown to you independently. So again, you can take a look at each of the samples and see what they did. Some people just did an exit ticket and just cut and pasted their objective next to the exit ticket. Very easy way to go. Other people said that on certain days it was more appropriate to collect the rubric because that day they had tried to do that that organizer independently. Now comes the fun part, methodology. The methodology research has been, around for a long time. Madeline Hunter is still considered to have the best basic principles in methodology. You want to be sure that those show up in a lesson plan. In other words, she called it anticipatory set, but basically, can you access prior knowledge at the beginning of every lesson so that you have Velcro of what you're sticking it to? Can you have multiple scaffolded exposures? In other words, whatever my objective is, I need to show how I model it to them, how they have guided practice, and how they have independent practice. Lots of people forget the independent practice piece of this, and that's why their students don't get totally toward mastery. Finally, be sure you have checks for understanding throughout, and some closure at the end. So, you just want to make sure that in the methodology, they've thought through these pieces. When you look at the samples, when I have teachers do it, I like them to label each one so I know that it's there. So PK is prior knowledge, and then model, GP is guided practice, IP is independent practice, and then closure is on there. I don't have them label checks for understanding because that's done informally throughout the whole lesson. So you could see how that could break down. Now here's the one caveat before you look at it. Because skills in reading sometimes take so many days to go through, you may not model, guide, and independent the same day. You may spread it out over 3 days. You may model the strategy the first day, and all you want them to be able to do is just define it for you, even though you modeled the whole thing. The next day, you might have them do guided practice with a new text. The next day is when they would actually do it independent. So if you look at the 5th grade example, she's a good one to see of how she did model one day, guide the next, independent the next. So you can take a quick minute to see how different teachers adapted this in different way to fit their needs. Some teachers also got more or less detailed, and that's okay as well, as long as the basic principles with research behind them are there. The last thing that I do is find my resources. Now that I know exactly what the skills need, I know how many texts I'm going to have to use, which is going to be a lot. We're not talking about I get one text for the unit, one for the assessment. I probably need to have used and done this skill multiple times with multiple texts. So I want to fill out my resource section. When you fill out the resource section, you want to identify the text and where you got it from. Because if anyone else was ever going to use this, they need to know, did this come from your Houghton Mifflin? Did I get this from online? Who's the author of it? You want to be as specific as possible. If they're talking about using clips from the internet, because a lot of times that's helpful for little pieces, they should use the link there. Because it took them hours to find that link the first time. Don't ever waste that time again. You know, cut and paste the link on there as well. So again, you can look at the examples. Some people didn't need as many for their units because they were more limited in their resources. Other people had all of these things that were available to them. That really can depend on your own site. But texts are easy to access. Everybody's books have phenomenal literature texts in them. Also, there are lots of online sites where you can either get text for free, literature informational, or for very low cost. I talk a lot about reading A to Z. I think the license now is a little more, it's like $80, but still it's $80 for a year, and there are hundreds of texts that are already leveled for you, informational and literature, that also say which skill it's closest aligned to use it for. Because some skills are easier to use with some texts than others. It's a great resource that's relatively inexpensive. Reading A, and then it's -z.com. It's a website. You can have your students, if you have iPads, just pull it up. You can print them off and make copies. If you print them off and make copies, I just encourage you to do it in a way you can reuse them over and over again. But there are easy ways to access both informational and literary resources without having to go purchase, big new things.